Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The endless black stretched beyond the observation deck, an infinite void pricked with cold, indifferent stars. Commander Elias Rains stood at the heart of it, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders squared with quiet confidence. He was staring into the abyss, but he was not searching for comfort in the stars, nor was he lost in thought. No, his gaze was fixed on something far beyond human sight, something moving toward them with all the certainty of storm. 5,000 Xaner warships, an armada engineered for conquest, designed with ruthless precision, armed with weapons that could carve through planetary crusts like a hot knife through flesh. Against that, humanity had 30 ships. Not 30 dreadnoughts, not 30 capital-class vessels, just 30 warships, smaller, slower, armed with whatever aging weapons Earth's fleets could muster. In every measurable way, they were doomed. Yet Elias Rains smiled. The bridge of the Dauntless hummed with low voices and blinking displays, the quiet rhythm of minds sharpening for battle. Officers moved with the rigid efficiency of those who had faced death before and had learned to function under its shadow. They did not flinch at the unreadable expression on their commander's face, but they watched him, waiting. Lieutenant Voss approached with a datapad in hand, her posture sharp as a blade. "Commander," she said, voice clipped professional. "Enemy fleet maintains course. No deviations. Our scouts report no sign that they've detected us." Of course, they haven't, Rains thought. Why would they? To the Xaner, this was not a battle. It was an extermination. A mere inconvenience to be removed from their path. Their fleets, vast and all-consuming, had spent centuries expanding, stamping out resistance before it could become meaningful. Humanity was no different to them than any of the countless species they had crushed before. They had not come expecting a fight. They had come expecting a surrender. Their arrogance would be their first mistake. "Good," Rains said, turning away from the viewport. "We'll keep it that way." He crossed the bridge with measured strides, his long coat sweeping behind him. His officers tracked his movements with the wariness of soldiers awaiting their orders. But beneath their disciplined silence, he could feel the tension simmering. They had followed him through hell before, through impossible victories, battles where numbers alone should have condemned them. But this was something else entirely. Captain Darnell, broad-shouldered, his voice like grinding stone, leaned against the hollow table, studying the fleet projections with a scowl. "I'll be honest, sir. 30 against 5,000 isn't a fight. It's a goddamn execution." A dry chuckle escaped Rains's lips. "That depends entirely on how you define a fight." He tapped a command into the interface, and the holographic display shifted, unfolding the Xaner fleet in intricate, predatory detail. Their formation was textbook, an aggressive wedge, with lighter assault ships forming the tip of the spear, meant to shatter enemy defenses before the heavy cruisers and battleships arrived to finish the job. At the very back, nestled behind an ocean of firepower, their command ships loomed, shielded, untouchable. A perfect strategy, a fatal flaw. "The Xaner believe in overwhelming force," Rains said, studying the display as if inspecting the fault lines in a fragile piece of glass. "They think a battle is won by firepower alone. That war is a question of who brings the bigger hammer." He turned, tapping 2 fingers against his temple. "But a battle isn't won with weapons. It's won up here. And we're going to make them question everything they know." Silence stretched across the bridge. Then Darnell exhaled, a slow, rough sound, and the edge of a grin curled at his lips. "I assume you have something in mind?" Rains nodded, eyes still on the display. "Deploy the decoy drones. Scatter them across a 300,000-kilometer radius and have them broadcast false fleet signals at staggered intervals. Every 5 hours, I want the Xaner reading a different set of targets." Lieutenant Voss was already entering the commands. "Understood, sir." And when they realize the deception, "They won't," Rain said simply. "Not until it's too late." The truth was, deception was only the first layer of the strategy. The Xaner were a race bred for war, their strategies honed through centuries of conquest, but that was precisely why Reigns knew how to break them. When a civilization fights the same way for long enough, it begins to mistake its own methods for universal law. The Zaner didn't account for anything outside of their doctrine because they had never needed to. But humans? Humans had never had the luxury of fighting fair fights. That was what set them apart. The Zaner had spent centuries perfecting the art of war. Humanity had spent just as long perfecting the art of survival. The difference was everything. "Lieutenant," Reigns said, glancing at Voss. "What's the first rule of war?" She hesitated, then answered, "Control the battlefield." "Exactly," Reigns said. He turned back to the projection of the Zaner fleet, a storm of death bearing down on them. "And what's the second rule?" This time, she didn't answer. Reigns smiled. "Make them think they're the ones in control." He turned back to the viewport, hands once again clasped behind his back. The enemy was coming. 5,000 ships against 30. The kind of numbers that history would call impossible. But history was written by the victors, and Elias Reigns had no intention of losing. The void stretched out in all directions, an unfeeling abyss that had swallowed countless civilizations before humanity had ever reached the stars. Somewhere in that black expanse, a war was already unfolding, not with fire and fury, but in the quiet spaces between decisions, in the delicate balance of doubt and certainty. The Dauntless remained hidden in the darkness, a lone ember against an oncoming inferno. But Elias Reigns knew that fire, unchecked, could consume itself just as easily as it could consume its enemies. On the bridge, a soft hum filled the air, the quiet pulse of machinery, the subdued urgency of officers speaking in low voices. The Dauntless was not a warship in the traditional sense. It had no planet-cracking cannons, no fleets of drones to command. It was small, nimble, designed for survival in a galaxy that had no patience for weakness. And yet, it was here, poised against an enemy that should have crushed it without a second thought. But the Zaner were hesitating. Holographic displays shifted in real time, the cold blue glow painting sharp lines against the dim lighting of the bridge. Tactical maps tracked the Zaner fleet as it surged forward, no longer reacting to the decoy drones, but pushing past them. A formation meant to overwhelm, now barreling forward without its usual precision. The cracks in their discipline were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Reigns stood at the center of it all, his hands folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. His officers waited, some standing at attention, others glued to their terminals, scanning every shift in enemy movement. They knew better than to ask what came next. Reigns had led them through enough impossible battles that they understood how he worked. He would speak when he was ready. "They know," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying through the bridge. Lieutenant Voss turned from her station. "Sir?" Reigns stepped closer to the tactical display, studying the fleet's movement with narrowed eyes. "The Zaner aren't taking the bait," he continued. "They're not scanning for hidden ships, not adjusting for a wider engagement. They're accelerating." Captain Darnell exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "So they figured out the trick." "Not exactly," Reigns murmured. His gaze sharpened. If they were certain this was an illusion, they'd be more cautious. But they're not stopping. That means they're still unsure. They've decided that if there's a real threat, the best solution is to crush it beneath their numbers before it has a chance to act. A long silence stretched between them. Voss was the first to break it. "They're forcing our hand." Reigns nodded. "They want us to move first, to react." Darnell let out a low curse. Then we're back to square one. We wanted to trap them, but now they're charging straight for Arcadia Prime. We can't stop 5,000 ships in open combat. "No," Reigns agreed. "We can't." For a moment, he simply watched the shifting holograms, silent, calculating. Then, without looking away, he spoke. "Send a message to Arcadia Prime. Governor Steele needs to begin full-scale evacuations. No debates. No delays." Voss hesitated. "If we do that, the Zaner could intercept the transmission. If they weren't sure about us before. They already know we're here," Reigns cut in. "Or at least, they suspect. Right now, they think they can win by brute force. Let's not give them time to reconsider that assumption. Voss nodded, relaying the command. Darnell leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the hollow table. All right, so we're letting them rush forward. But if they hit Arcadia before we're ready, it's over. That's why we're not stopping them, Rains said. We're guiding them. Voss frowned. Sir, the Zaner have a perfect plan, Rains explained. Their wedge formation is designed to break through defensive lines before the bulk of their fleet even arrives. But there's one flaw in that strategy. It assumes they're the ones setting the pace of the battle. We take that away, and suddenly, their perfect formation becomes a liability. Darnell's frown deepened. How do we take control of the pacing when they outnumber us that badly? Rains finally turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the captain. We let them think they're already winning. The bridge fell silent again. He stepped closer to the projection, tapping a section of empty space near Arcadia Prime's orbit. There's a debris field here, remnants from the old mining operations before the colony was fully developed. Useless for anything except cluttering up sensor readings. Darnell's eyes narrowed. You're not thinking of hiding in there, are you? Their sensors might be blocked, but if they fire blindly, we'll be turned to scrap. I'm not hiding in it, Rains corrected. They are. Voss inhaled sharply. You're going to herd them into the debris field. Exactly, Rains said. Their formation works best in open space, where they can maximize their firepower and maneuverability. But in a field full of unstable wreckage, it becomes a liability. They'll be forced to break formation, slow down, adjust, and that hesitation will be all we need. Darnell let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You're a crazy bastard. Rains gave him a faint smile. Only when I have to be. Voss was already working through the logistics. We need to make sure they don't realize the danger until it's too late. If they detect what we're doing, they'll change course. That's why we make sure they can't change course, Rains said. Deploy the second wave of decoys behind them. Once they commit to the charge, we cut off their retreat. Darnell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. So we bait them in, block their exit, force them into chaos. His gaze flicked to the commander. And then what? Rains looked back at the projection. The Zaner fleet, still surging forward with the confidence of an unstoppable force, had no idea what awaited them. Then, he said quietly, we show them what desperation really looks like. For the first time since the battle had begun, Captain Darnell grinned. Across the bridge, the crew moved with renewed purpose. Orders were relayed, calculations adjusted, trajectories locked in. The pieces were set. The Zaner thought they were leading this fight, but Rains knew better. They were walking into their own grave, and they had no idea. The battle would begin soon, but it would not be fought on the Zaner's terms. It never had been. The Void did not care. It did not care about the warships that carved through it like blades. It did not care about the millions of lives hanging in the balance. It did not care that one empire had built itself upon the certainty of its own supremacy, nor that another species, outnumbered, outgunned, underestimated, was about to prove them wrong. Space was indifferent, but Elias Rains was not. He stood at the center of the dauntless bridge, bathed in the cold blue glow of the tactical display. Around him, his officers moved with quiet efficiency, voices clipped, motions precise. There was no wasted energy, no uncertainty. They had been through too much for that. This battle was not just another engagement. It was survival, and survival did not tolerate hesitation. Lieutenant Voss's voice cut through the low hum of the bridge. Zaner fleet is fully committed. They've entered the debris field at attack speed. Rains nodded, watching the formation shift in real time. The Zaner still held their spearhead shape, but subtle distortions had begun to spread through their ranks. Small hesitations, minor course corrections. The debris was doing its job, forcing them to adjust, to compensate, to slow down. Not enough to stop them. Not yet, but soon. Captain Darnell leaned forward, eyes narrowing. No sign they suspect anything? Voss shook her head. Their scans remained standard. No additional sweeps. They still think they're in control, Darnell muttered. They always do, right up until they're not. Rains said nothing. His gaze remained locked on the Zaner fleet. He wasn't watching their formation. He was watching the patterns beneath it, the shifts in movement, the invisible weight of uncertainty beginning to seep into their ranks. The Zaner had spent centuries perfecting the art of war, but perfection had a weakness. It left no room for adaptation. He could feel it happening. They were starting to lose their grip, but they didn't know it yet. The next move had to be precise. Too early, and the Zaner would have time to recover. Too late, and Arcadia Prime would burn before they ever knew what had gone wrong. He turned to Voss. Deploy second-wave decoys. Make them erratic, randomized energy signatures, false heat flares, intermittent distress signals. Voss's fingers flew across the console. Executing now. Across the battlefield, the deception came to life. Small, almost imperceptible distortions rippled through space. Ghost ships appearing and vanishing in the Zaner sensor arrays, as if human forces were scattered in the wreckage, hiding just beyond reach. To the Zaner, it would look like a desperate, uncoordinated resistance, survivors clinging to whatever concealment they could find. And that was exactly what Rains wanted them to think. Darnell exhaled, watching the display. They're reacting. The shift was minor at first. A few ships peeled away from the main formation, repositioning to cover their flanks. Then a full squadron adjusted course, responding to phantom threats. The Zaner were still advancing, but their cohesion was beginning to break. Rains allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. They're dividing their focus. Voss's eyes flickered with something close to admiration. They think they're hunting us. They always do, Rains said, right until they realize they're the ones being hunted. Then, something changed. The Zaner formation stiffened. The hesitation vanished. The scattered movements consolidated back into precise, ruthless alignment. And then, as if pulled by an unseen force, their entire fleet surged forward in unison, accelerating toward Arcadia Prime. Voss's console lit up with warning indicators. They're ignoring the decoys. Darnell's expression darkened. What the hell just happened? Rains's jaw tightened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't instinct. Check their command channels, he ordered. Something's changed. Voss's fingers flew over her controls. Lines of intercepted data scrolled across her screen, encrypted, precise. Then, her hands froze. Commander, she said, voice low. They've activated an emergency protocol. A fleet-wide AI override. Silence pressed down on the bridge. Rains's eyes narrowed. Explain. Voss swallowed. They've cut out human decision-making. Their ships aren't reacting to battlefield conditions anymore. They're executing a pre-programmed attack sequence. They don't need to adapt because the orders they're following don't require it. Darnell let out a slow, deliberate breath. You're saying they're not fighting us anymore? No, Rains said, his voice grim. They're not. The Zaner had abandoned strategy. They had abandoned command. They had abandoned everything that had made them an empire. Because they had chosen annihilation. Voss's screen pulsed with new data. They're accelerating again. At this speed, they'll reach Arcadia Prime in 15 minutes. Darnell exhaled sharply. Damn it, Rains. If they're not thinking anymore, how the hell do we stop them? Rains didn't answer. He was already thinking. Already seeing the board shift beneath his feet, the battle evolving into something new, something more dangerous. The Zaner had chosen to erase human error. That made them faster, more relentless, but also made them predictable. He turned to Voss. AI follows logic. What happens if the objective it's following ceases to exist? Voss blinked. It would reassess, adjust parameters. Then her eyes widened. Sir, you're not seriously suggesting. Darnell's head snapped toward him. You want to fake the destruction of Arcadia Prime? Rains nodded once. If they think the colony is already gone, their programming will force them to change course. They won't keep attacking an objective that doesn't exist. Voss was already shaking her head. Sir, they'll need confirmation. Just a lack of communication won't be enough. I know, Rains said. We need something bigger. His mind was already constructing the deception, piecing together the elements he needed. The colony's defense grid had orbital platforms, some still operational, some disabled. If those stations were detonated in sequence, it would mimic the pattern of a planetary scale bombardment. They could generate heat signatures large enough to suggest an uncontrolled reactor meltdown. And if they intercepted their own distress signals, made it seem like Arcadia Prime was sending out its final death throes. It could work. It had to work. Darnell ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. Rains allowed himself a small, sharp smile. So was fighting them in the first place. The bridge snapped into motion. Voss coordinated the sequence, calibrating detonations for maximum effect. Engineering teams rerouted energy signatures, creating the illusion of a dying world. Across the fleet, pilots adjusted formations, ensuring no human transmissions could betray the deception. Outside, the first explosions erupted. The orbital platforms detonated in perfect sequence, fire and debris scattering into space. Radiation bursts flooded the surrounding area, the kind only produced by catastrophic energy failure. Arcadia Prime's last transmission was sent out, a garbled, static-filled distress call, a planetary government collapsing into silence. Then nothing. The Zaner fleet hesitated. The unstoppable war machine, the empire built upon absolute certainty, hesitated. Seconds passed. Then their formation wavered. Then, slowly, methodically, they turned. Rains exhaled. Darnell let out a disbelieving laugh. Son of a bitch. Voss slumped back in her chair, eyes wide. They bought it. Rains nodded, watching the Zaner retreat. They weren't defeated. Not yet. But they had lost this battle. And for the first time in their history, they had been outmaneuvered. Space did not care. But tonight, it had made room for an impossibility. Humanity had survived. The Zaner fleet drifted into the void, vanishing into the same darkness from which it had once emerged. Their retreat was not frantic, nor was it disorderly. It was mechanical, methodical, an execution of protocol rather than an act of fear. They had no emotions to guide them, no instincts to betray uncertainty. Their fleet-wide AI had simply calculated that the battle was no longer winnable. The deception had worked. Elias Rains exhaled, long and slow, feeling the weight that had been crushing his chest ease, if only slightly. Around him, the bridge of the Dauntless remained silent. Every officer watching the shrinking enemy's signatures with a disbelief they dared not put into words. The impossible had happened. Captain Darnell let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. I'd call that a miracle if I thought you believed in those, Commander. Rains didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the display, still waiting for the pattern to change, for the Zaner to reveal some unseen contingency. But they didn't. Their formation remained rigid, a fleet that had not been defeated in combat, but redirected, outmaneuvered in a way they could neither comprehend nor counter. We forced their hand, he said finally. Nothing miraculous about that. Lieutenant Voss turned from her console, her expression carefully neutral, though a trace of tension still lingered at the corners of her mouth. We bought time, but we both know this isn't over. Rains nodded. That was the truth of it. The Zaner weren't beaten, not truly. They had withdrawn, but not out of fear, not out of weakness. Their programming had dictated the most efficient response to a battlefield that no longer fit within their parameters. They would return, and when they did, they would not be so easily deceived. We need to move, Rains said. The longer we stay, the more likely they are to reassess the situation. Signal the fleet. We regroup beyond the asteroid belt and run full scans for any cloaked enemy vessels. I don't want to assume their withdrawal is absolute. Voss relayed the orders. The bridge stirred back into motion, officers snapping back to their duties, the quiet hum of activity returning. Darnell ran a hand over his jaw. Arcadia Prime's not going to like this. Rains glanced at him. They're alive to not like it. Darnell gave a short, rough laugh. Fair enough. The comms panel chimed, and a voice filled the bridge, a voice thick with tension, exhaustion, and something dangerously close to fury. This is Governor Steele. Rains exhaled before pressing the transmission button. Governor. A pause. Then, I want an explanation, Commander. Her tone was controlled, but only barely. He didn't blame her. From the colony's perspective, they had been abandoned to destruction. The Zaner had surged toward them. Their doom had seemed imminent. And then, silence. No final battle, no last stand. Just silence. And then explosions in the sky that had looked like the end of Arcadia Prime. Rains knew exactly how it must have felt. The Zaner were operating under AI control. He said evenly. We couldn't stop them through force, so we convinced them there was no longer a target worth pursuing. Another pause. He could almost hear steel grinding her teeth. You tricked them. Yes. A breath. Do you have any idea what that did to the people down here? Yes. That silence was longer. When Steele spoke again, her voice was quieter. They thought they were dying. Rains closed his eyes for half a second before opening them again. I know. It wasn't an apology. He wouldn't insult her with one. He had made a choice, and that choice had saved millions of lives. He would not regret it. But that did not mean he didn't understand the cost. Steele exhaled. And now, they'll return, Rains said. They always do. But not today. No. A longer pause. Then we have work to do. She cut the transmission before he could respond. Darnell let out a low whistle. I think that was her way of saying thank you. Rains glanced at him. You think so? No, Darnell admitted. But I figured saying it out loud might make it feel true. Voss turned from her console, frowning. Sir, we have an anomaly. Rains straightened. Explain. She adjusted the display, highlighting a section of the battlefield. The Zaner fleet had left, but something remained. A single, drifting vessel, smaller than the others, its energy readings unstable. A Zaner warship? Darnell asked. No, Voss said. It's human. Rain stepped closer to the display, studying the fractured data. It was barely readable. The ship's hull scorched, its communications array damaged beyond function. Darnell's frown deepened. I don't recognize the design. Neither did Rains. And that, more than anything, made his stomach tighten. He turned sharply. Get a retrieval team prepped. I want that ship brought aboard immediately. Voss hesitated. Sir, we don't know what. That's the point, Rains said. We don't know. And right now, I'm not in the mood for more unknowns. She relayed the order. Minutes later, a small strike team launched from the Dauntless, maneuvering toward the wreckage. The bridge remained silent, officers watching the feed as the soldiers breached the damaged ship's hull. Static filled the speakers. Then, Commander, a voice crackled through. We have something. Someone. Rains's gut tightened. Clarify. A pause. Then, there's a survivor. Human. And, sir, I don't know how, but they've been out here a long time. Rains's fingers curled into his palm. Define a long time. Static. And the soldier's voice low, almost disbelieving. Sir, this ship is over 200 years old. The bridge fell into stunned silence. Rains exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. This battle had ended, but something far older had just begun. The ship was a graveyard. The retrieval team moved through its corridors in practice formation, weapons raised, boots whispering against the scorched metal. The air was thin, stale with the scent of rust and time. It clung to them, thick and lifeless, a reminder that no breath had been drawn here for centuries. Commander Elias Rains stood on the Dauntless Bridge, eyes locked onto the live feed from the soldiers' helmet cams. The wreckage was old, too old. 200 years adrift in the void, yet somehow, impossibly, still intact. And inside, a survivor. It shouldn't have been possible. Status? He asked, voice sharp. Lieutenant Voss didn't look up from her console. The team is moving deeper into the ship. Life support is barely functional, but it's holding. They've confirmed human remains, dozens of them. Looks like the crew didn't make it. Rains watched the screen as the soldiers pushed through a collapsed bulkhead, beams of light cutting through the dust. The insignia on the walls was faded, but unmistakable, a relic from the early days of human space exploration, long before the war with the Zaner. Darnell leaned against the hollow table, arms crossed. A ship this old? We don't have records of anything being out here that long. How the hell did it get past the outer colonies? Rains had no answer. The lead soldier's voice crackled through the comms. Commander, we have the survivor. He's a pause. A long, unnerving pause. Then, you need to see this. A second later, the bridge screen flickered to show the inside of what had once been the ship's cryo bay. Pods lined the walls, their glass coated in frost, their systems long since drained of power. Most have failed. Their occupants, little more than bones wrapped in brittle fabric. But one remained active. The figure inside was pale, emaciated but alive. Tubes ran from his arms into machinery, barely functioning after centuries of neglect. His face was obscured by a breathing mask, but even through the frost-covered glass, Rains could see the slow, shallow movement of his chest. A man, impossibly old yet untouched by time. Voss exhaled. How is he alive? Rains didn't answer. He was already turning. Bring him in. Now. The retrieval was delicate. The ship's systems were failing, and the cryopod was deteriorating. Med teams met the soldiers at the docking bay, their hands moving with trained precision to stabilize a body that shouldn't have survived. Rains watched from the med bay's viewing platform as they worked, his thoughts running too fast to grasp. This wasn't just a lost ship. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was something else. Darnell stepped beside him. You know what I don't like about this? Rains sighed. That you can only pick one thing. Darnell huffed, rubbing his jaw. What I don't like is that this ship should have been dust 100 years ago. I don't like that we found it right after pulling the biggest con in human history against the Zaner. And I really don't like the fact that this guy survived against every damn law of physics we know. Rains couldn't argue with that. The med bay's containment doors sealed with a quiet hiss as the team finished their initial work. The survivor had been disconnected from the failing machinery and moved into a secure observation unit, his vitals stabilizing. Voss appeared at their side. The doctors say he's in a state of induced stasis. His metabolism is barely functioning. Whatever kept him alive, it wasn't standard cryotech. Rain studied the figure through the reinforced glass. Then what was it? No one had an answer. Minutes stretched. Then movement. It was subtle at first. A twitch of fingers, a flutter of eyelids. Then his breath hitched, his body shuddered, and with a sharp, gasping inhale, he woke. Alarm spiked as the medical team rushed forward, but the man didn't thrash, didn't panic. His eyes snapped open, clear, lucid aware. Not the dazed, sluggish confusion of someone emerging from centuries of sleep. He looked at the ceiling. Then, slowly, he turned his head, locked eyes with Rains through the glass. And he spoke, not in confusion, not in fear, but as if he had been expecting this moment. It took you long enough. Silence fell. A thick, heavy silence that carried the weight of something deeply, terribly wrong. Rain stepped forward. Who are you? The man exhaled, his voice hoarse but steady. I was the first, he said. Then, quieter, almost himself. And now, I am the last. Voss stiffened. What does that mean? The man's eyes drifted to her, then back to Rains. I know why the Zaner are really here. The room stilled. Rains felt the shift, the invisible moment when a battle ends, but a greater war begins. Then start talking. The room was too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't just exist. It pressed down, thick and unyielding, stretching the seconds longer than they should be. The man on the other side of the glass had spoken as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if waking up from 200 years adrift was nothing more than stepping into a conversation left unfinished. Elias Rains studied him, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The medical team hovered close, scanning his vitals, muttering quiet confirmations that defied logic. The man, whoever he was not only stable, but functioning at full cognitive capacity. No memory loss, no muscle degradation, no signs that he should be suffering the effects of time. He was a ghost from the past. Yet he looked at them as if he had seen the future. Rain spoke first. You said you know why the Zaner are here. The man's eyes flickered toward him, assessing, measuring. Then he exhaled. Yes. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Darnell, standing stiffly beside Rains, let out a short, humorless breath. Well, don't make us beg for it. The man shifted, testing his limbs as if remembering how to move. His voice, when he spoke again, was smoother, stronger. You think they came for conquest? That they see you as another species to subjugate? He shook his head. That's not why they're here. Rains narrowed his eyes. Then what? The man met his gaze. They're looking for something. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Voss, standing near the medical monitors, frowned. What could we possibly have that they don't? The man gave a faint, tired smile. Something we lost a long time ago. Rain stepped forward. Start from the beginning. The man's gaze drifted past him, unfocused for a moment, as if reaching for something buried deep. Then he spoke. A long time ago, before humanity had even imagined itself reaching this far into the stars, the Zaner already knew we would. Silence. Voss stiffened. That's impossible. We didn't even make first contact with them until they let you. The man interrupted. His tone was even patient, but it left no room for argument. You think they discovered you when you began expanding beyond Soul, but they've known about you for far longer. They've been waiting. Darnell scoffed. For what? For us to find it, the man said simply. Rains's jaw tightened. Find what? The man exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as if the weight of the answer had been pressing on him for too long. Humanity isn't unique in its ambition. We weren't the first to build, to explore, to wage war among the stars. But we were the first to be left behind. He glanced at them. We weren't always alone. A slow, creeping cold spread through Rains's chest. Darnell muttered a curse. You're saying there was another species before us? The man gave a slight nod. Not just a species, a civilization. One that stretched across the galaxy long before we took our first steps beyond Earth. He paused. And then, suddenly, they were gone. The room held its breath. Rains's mind worked fast, piecing together what little was known about the ancient ruins humanity had stumbled upon over the years. Fragments of structures on dead worlds, remnants of technology that didn't match any known design. The Zaner had always dismissed them as irrelevant, refusing to acknowledge any history that did not begin with their own dominion. If this man was telling the truth, that refusal was not arrogance. It was fear. Voss's voice was quiet. The Zaner knew about them. They did more than know, the man said. They hunted them. They erased them. And when the last of them fell, the Zaner believed their empire was safe. His gaze darkened, until they found traces of something they had missed. Something buried. Something hidden. He looked at Rains. Something humanity had been left to find. The weight of it settled heavy in the air. Rains's voice was controlled, but edged. You're saying we were what? A contingency. The man shook his head. Not a contingency. A consequence. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Darnell's patience frayed. All right, enough riddles. If the Zaner wiped out an entire civilization, why the hell would they let us survive? They didn't, the man said simply. Silence. Rains's chest tightened. Explain. The man leaned forward slightly, the first real sign of urgency on his face. Something happened. Something even the Zaner don't understand. When they turned their attention to humanity, they found that we had already lost everything. Our history, our knowledge, even the memory of what came before us, it was gone. Erased. Not by them, but by something else. The words sank in like a slow-building storm. Voss's fingers curled against her console. You're saying we forgot? As an entire species? The man nodded. Not forgot. We're made to forget. Darnell let out a low breath. By what? The man hesitated, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it was, the Zaner fear it more than they fear anything else. The thought sent an uneasy current through Rains's mind. The Zaner were ruthless, unyielding. They had no concept of mercy, no hesitation in crushing anything they deemed a threat. If they feared something enough to leave it untouched, to avoid even speaking of it, then it was beyond anything humanity had yet encountered. And if the Zaner were here now, searching, it meant that whatever they had buried, whatever they had once tried to erase, it was waking up. Rains turned to Voss. How long until the Zaner realize Arcadia Prime still exists? Voss swallowed. 12 hours. Maybe less. Darnell tensed. And what happens when they do? Rains met his gaze. They stopped pretending they only wanted to conquer us. The room felt colder. The man on the table took a slow breath. This war isn't about territory, he said. It never was. He exhaled. It's about what's buried beneath your feet. The weight of it pressed into them all. Rain straightened. He had spent years outmaneuvering enemies, winning impossible battles. But this was something else. If humanity was standing on the ruins of a war fought before history began, then the battle with the Zaner was no longer about survival. It was about who would find the truth first, and whether the truth was meant to stay buried.